most advanced Chinese EV ever built just landed in Canada, and the brands that have owned this market for decades have exactly one winter to figure out their response. Most people are asking the wrong question. They're debating whether it's good enough. The real question is whether the established brands are still worth the premium, and the answer is more uncomfortable than anyone is admitting. Here's the open loop that doesn't close until the end. This vehicle could be the best value proposition in Canadian automotive history, or it could be the most sophisticated trap ever set for an early adopter. By the end of this, the evidence points clearly in one direction. Canada is not the largest EV market in the world. It's not the most politically symbolic, not the highest volume, and not the easiest logistical target for a foreign automaker trying to scale. So why does it matter? Because Canada functions as a stress test that almost no other market replicates cleanly. The climate range alone, from mild coastal winters in British Columbia to sustained deep freeze conditions across the prairies in Ontario, creates a proving ground that exposes every weakness an EV can carry. Range penalties in cold weather aren't theoretical here. They're a lived reality that affects buying decisions, charging habits, and daily planning in ways that a market like California simply cannot replicate. Then, there's the geographic reality of the country itself. Long-distance travel between cities isn't optional for many Canadians. The charging infrastructure, while growing, remains uneven across regions. The gap between an EV's highway range on a warm day and its real-world capability on a cold one isn't a footnote in Canada. It's a central purchase question. Here's the first mini decision worth making right now. If a vehicle delivers 30% less range in February than the spec sheet promises, does that disqualify it? Or does every EV on the market carry the same penalty, making the comparison still valid? The answer matters, because it determines which standard this vehicle actually gets held to. Canada's buyer profile at the $50,000 to $80,000 segment skews toward value sensitivity in a way that makes this market particularly revealing. Buyers hear research, they compare, they talk to each other at length, and that word-of-mouth economy means a genuinely good ownership experience compounds fast, and so does a genuinely bad one. What happens in Canada carries a signal well beyond its borders. This is the market where the verdict gets written first. The word advanced is doing a lot of work right now. It deserves interrogation before it gets accepted. There are two categories of technology in any modern EV. The first is showroom technology, the features that create an impression during a test drive. The panoramic displays, the ambient lighting systems, the gesture controls, the level of fit and finish that photographs well and reads as premium at first contact. This category matters, but it flatters almost every Chinese EV at this segment level, because the domestic Chinese market has made high-specification interiors the minimum expectation, not a differentiator. The second category is daily life technology, the features that have to work quietly, reliably, and correctly thousands of times without the customer noticing them. Thermal management that preserves battery health across climate extremes, charging curve consistency over a long ownership period, software update stability that doesn't introduce regressions, sensor calibration on driver assistance systems that functions correctly in reduced visibility winter conditions. Here's where the first real chasm opens. Chinese automakers at the leading edge of their domestic market have closed the showroom gap almost entirely. The daily life gap is less clear because Canadian data doesn't exist at scale yet. That's not speculation, it's simply a function of time and market. So the honest answer to "is this advanced?" is advanced in the ways that are easy to measure and genuinely promising but unproven in the ways that take years to confirm. If that distinction sounds like a hedge, consider that it's the same distinction that applied to Tesla in 2013, to Hyundai's EV lineup in 2019, and to every brand that eventually earned its trust through accumulated owner experience rather than launch day credibility. The question isn't whether this vehicle is advanced, it's whether advanced is the right frame or whether reliable is the one that actually matters in Canada. Every flagship EV arriving in this segment carries some version of a driver assistance system with a name, a marketing narrative, and a promise that implies more than the legal disclaimers permit. This vehicle is no exception. Based on what manufacturer documentation has described, the system uses a high-density sensor suite and onboard computing architecture that positions it alongside and in certain hardware metrics ahead of systems from established players. That's the stated promise. Here's the part being skipped in most coverage. Hardware capability and real-world trustworthiness are not the same variable. Driver assistance systems are only as reliable as their edge case handling. How the system behaves at the boundary of its competence in a whiteout, on an unmarked rural road, in a construction zone with contradictory lane signals is not something a manufacturer video demonstrates. It's something real owners discover over tens of thousands of kilometers in conditions that don't appear in training data. That's where the story flips. This is not a criticism unique to this vehicle. Tesla's autopilot carries a regulatory record. Hyundai systems have documented limitations in adverse weather that owners have reported publicly. The standard being applied here shouldn't be perfection. It should be honesty about limitations and a demonstrable cadence of improvement. The mini decision for right now is a driver assistance system from a brand with no North American track record inherently less trustworthy than one from a brand with a mixed but documented record. There's a reasonable argument that the honest unknown is preferable to the known but unresolved. There's also a reasonable argument that it isn't. Both positions are defensible, which is exactly why this debate will continue long after this video ends. Range figures published by automakers are produced under standardized test conditions. Those conditions do not include a Winnipeg January. They do not include a preconditioning run at -25, a 1-hour highway drive into a headwind, or a charging stop where the station's own thermal management is compromised by the cold. Real-world cold weather range penalties for battery electric vehicles have been documented by third-party testing organizations and owner-reported data at somewhere between 15 and 40% below rated range, depending on temperature, speed, cabin heating demand, and crucially, the quality of the vehicle's thermal architecture. That spread is wide enough to mean the difference between an acceptable winter experience and a planning-intensive one. What separates the better cold weather performers from the worse ones is almost never raw battery size. It's thermal architecture, a system with active thermal management that preconditions the battery en route to a charger, that maintains cell temperatures within an efficient operating window, and that recovers heat from the drivetrain rather than relying entirely on resistive heating. The system produces a fundamentally different ownership experience in February than one that doesn't. But there's a catch. Thermal architecture quality cannot be confirmed from a spec sheet. It gets confirmed by owners, in Regina writing forum posts after their first real winter. It gets confirmed when third-party testing organizations publish cold weather range data from a full season of driving. Neither of those data sources exists at Canadian scale yet for this vehicle. Here's what is known. The daily grind of EV ownership in cold climates isn't about peak performance. It's about the accumulation of small frictions. The charge stop that takes longer than expected because the battery arrived cold. The range estimate that revises downward mid-highway. The rerouting decision made in a snowstorm. Those moments, compounded over a season, are what convert buyers into advocates or into cautionary tales shared in parking lots. The winter verdict for this vehicle will be written by Canadian owners, not by the manufacturer, and that verdict starts this coming February. Here is where the competitive implications become genuinely uncomfortable for established brands. Chinese EV manufacturers at the technology frontier of their domestic market have achieved something that took legacy automakers decades to build: interior specification and feature density that challenges vehicles positioned 1 or 2 price segments above them. Not in every dimension, but in enough dimensions that the comparison becomes a productive exercise for any consumer doing real research. The specific pressure point is this: when a vehicle offers comparable or superior display integration, comparable ambient experience, a competitive software interface, and comparable powertrain output, at a price that undercuts the benchmark by a margin representing months of the average Canadian household's income, the value argument of the incumbent becomes structurally harder to sustain. This is not hypothetical. Hyundai and Kia have already experienced this disruption from their own elevated value positioning. Polestar exists in a segment this class of Chinese EV now directly enters. BMW and Mercedes are watching a category of buyer who would have defaulted to a German badge 5 years ago, now running a genuinely different comparison set. And this is the part that doesn't get said clearly enough. The incumbent's strongest remaining argument isn't technology. It's the ownership ecosystem. Service network depth, parts availability, resale predictability, insurance familiarity, decades of regional adaptation. Those aren't trivial advantages. They're the actual premium being charged. The real threat from this vehicle isn't what it offers. It's the question it forces incumbents to answer publicly. Exactly what is that ecosystem premium worth in dollars? And is the product behind it still superior enough to justify it? No serious evaluation stops at the product. The product is the easy part. Service availability for a brand with limited Canadian presence is a legitimate structural concern. If a sensor in the driver assistance system fails or a thermal management component needs replacement, how many days does the repair take? Where does the part originate? Which facilities are trained and certified to perform the work? Established brands answer these questions through decades of accumulated dealer infrastructure. A new entrant answers them through early owner experience, and that experience is still being written. Warranty interpretation is similarly unresolved, not in the written terms, which may be competitive, but in execution. How disputes are handled in practice, how software-related failures are categorized, whether a third-party charging event affects coverage eligibility. These answers only emerge through cases, and Canadian buyers now are necessarily financing that knowledge base for everyone who comes after them. Resale value carries its own open question. Canadian used EV markets are still establishing baselines for vehicles from non-legacy brands. A buyer planning to hold for 3 to 5 years before trading is making a compounded bet that the brand achieves sufficient Canadian presence and trust that the vehicle retains meaningful resale value. That bet may prove correct. It has not yet been confirmed by market data. Software governance deserves direct attention. Over-the-air updates are a genuine benefit when they add functionality and resolve known issues. They become a complication when they alter behavior in safety-adjacent systems, or when an update introduces instability that requires a rollback. The governance structure around those updates, approval processes, testing protocols, owner notification practices, is something prospective buyers should ask about explicitly, because it varies significantly across manufacturers and is rarely volunteered in sales conversations. These are the friction points that don't appear in launch videos. They appear in owner forums at month 14. Here's the split that actually drives the comment section on every video like this one. Side 1. A buyer who looks at this vehicle's feature density per dollar, compares it honestly to what incumbents are charging for equivalent or lesser specification, and concludes that the ecosystem gap is a transitional problem, one that closes as the brand builds Canadian presence, as service infrastructure expands, and as software cycles accumulate without major regressions. That buyer is making a coherent, evidence-based decision. They're not naive. They're making an informed, early adopter bet. Side 2. A buyer who looks at the same vehicle and concludes that the ecosystem premium charged by established brands isn't a rational markup, it's compressed risk insurance. The service certainty, the resale floor, the software track record, the regulatory familiarity. That buyer is also making a coherent, evidence-based decision. They're pricing the things that don't appear on a spec sheet. The debate between those two positions isn't resolvable today. But here's what would resolve it, and this is the part that usually stays too abstract. 3 observable, concrete conditions that would close the case for the value side. First, a service and parts network that reaches response time parity with established brands in major Canadian markets, documented not by the manufacturer, but by independent owner reporting. Second, a software update history over a minimum of 4 consecutive release cycles, showing no safety-adjacent regressions and a transparent changelog. Third, third-party cold weather range testing published by organizations with no commercial relationship to the brand, covering at least one full Canadian winter season. When those three conditions are met, not promised, not projected, but documented, the value case stops being an early adopter argument and becomes the mainstream argument. That's when the incumbent's pricing power genuinely erodes, not before. The question worth sitting with: are those conditions likely to be met within 2 years? The trajectory of this manufacturer's development cycle suggests yes. The history of foreign automotive brands entering North American markets suggests the timeline is usually longer than the optimists expect. The honest verdict is this: it is a genuinely serious product from a manufacturer that has earned technical credibility in the world's most competitive EV market. Its presence in Canada is not a curiosity. It is a calculated entry into a proving ground that will stress test it more honestly than almost any other market on Earth. The value case is real. The technology foundation is real. The cold weather unknowns, the service infrastructure gap, the software track record gap, and the resale uncertainty are also real, and they don't disappear because the vehicle is impressive at launch. What Canada will deliver over the next 18 to 36 months is not a verdict from reviewers or from this video. It will be a verdict from owners, the ones who drove it through their first prairie winter, who needed service for the first time, who watched their resale estimate move, who received a software update at month 18 and noticed what changed. Those owners are the actual jury. The product made the argument clearly. Canada is the courtroom, and the sentence gets handed down one ownership experience at a time. This vehicle could represent the moment the value calculus in Canadian EVs shifted permanently, or it could represent the moment a compelling product met an immature ecosystem and taught a generation of buyers an expensive lesson about the difference between a great car and a complete ownership experience. Both outcomes are possible. Only one of them is currently supported by evidence. So here's the question that splits every room on this topic. When a vehicle demonstrably outspecifies the competition at a lower price, is choosing the established brand a rational decision? Or is it just brand loyalty with better PR?